For decades, Japan's economy was this absolute global powerhouse. But since the early 1990s, the story has been all about a long period of stagnation, famously known as the lost 30 years. So let's dive into what that really means and ask the big question: is a new chapter finally beginning? And just to give you a sense of what a big deal this is, think about this. At its peak, Japan was the undisputed #2 economy in the entire world. But by 2023, it had slipped down to 4th place. Now that's not just some random number on a chart, it's a sign of a massive shift in the global economic pecking order. So what exactly are we talking about when we say the lost 30 years? Well, it all points back to this extended era right after an incredible property and stock market bubble just burst. The fallout from that was huge, and it led to decades of really sluggish growth and this persistent, tricky problem called deflation, which is when prices consistently fall and it just sucks the energy out of the economy. Okay, here's our game plan for this explainer. First, we're gonna look at what an economy on pause actually looks like. Then, we'll dig into the root causes. After that, we'll explore a totally different, more nuanced perspective on this era. And finally, we'll ask if Japan is standing at a brand new turning point. All right, so let's get right into it with the diagnosis. What does 3 decades of economic stagnation really look like on the ground? Well, the comparison here is pretty stark. While other major G7 economies were growing at a pretty steady clip, Japan's average real GDP growth struggled to even hit 1% a year. You can just see how much the country's economic engine slowed down compared to all of its peers. And this isn't just some abstract, high-level story. No, this has had a real impact on people's lives. Japan's GDP per person, which is a really key way to measure living standards, has actually fallen to the lowest among all the G7 nations. It means that stagnation has been felt on a very personal level. So we've seen the what. Now for the really interesting part, unpacking the why. What on earth were the root causes that led to such a long slump? You can really trace the whole story through a series of shocks and the responses to them. It all kicks off with that massive asset bubble bursting back in the early 90s. That triggered a huge banking crisis, which was then made even worse by the 2008 global financial crisis. And all along the way, you had these major policy pushes like Abenomics trying to get the engine started again. It was really a perfect storm, a cascade of problems that all fed into each other. The bubble's collapse left banks drowning in mountains of bad loans. And honestly, the official response to clean up that mess was just too slow. Add to that a delay in making some really necessary structural changes to things like the labor market, all while deflation took hold, making everyone hesitant to spend or invest. Now, underneath all this, there's this really fascinating demographic puzzle. Japan's working age population, it actually peaked way back in 1995 and has been getting smaller ever since. Now, basic economics would tell you that a smaller pool of workers should mean higher wages, as companies have to compete for them, right? And that brings us to the absolute heart of the matter. If the number of available workers has been falling for decades, why in the world haven't wages gone up? This is probably one of the biggest mysteries of the entire lost 30 years. Well, a huge part of the answer comes down to one word: globalization. When Japanese companies started facing that labor shortage at home, they made what seemed like a very rational choice. Instead of getting into a costly war for wages, they just moved production overseas, tapping into China's massive, and I mean massive, labor pool. This was great for keeping production costs down, but it also meant there was zero pressure to raise wages back home in Japan. And that lasted for nearly 3 decades. Okay, so far, the picture we've painted seems pretty bleak. But what if the lost 30 years wasn't a total failure? What if we look at this whole thing from a completely different angle? You can really view this period in 2 different ways. On the one hand, yeah, it was an economic failure, marked by low growth and wages that went nowhere. But on the other hand, some people argue that it was actually a strategic choice. By putting stable employment and social harmony first, Japan managed to avoid the massive spikes in inequality that we saw in so many other developed countries. And this is so important because if you only look at the economic numbers, you are missing a huge part of the story. Society is about so much more than just GDP, and in many other ways, Japan was far from lost. I mean, check this out. During these 3 decades, Japan produced more winners of the Pritzker Prize, which is like the Nobel for architecture, than any other country. It also had a stunning number of its scientists win Nobel Prizes, and its global cultural footprint in things like music and sports just kept getting bigger. So while the economy was kind of stuck in neutral, culture and science were absolutely firing on all cylinders. So where does that leave us today? After 30 long years, are there finally some winds of change that could signal a real, honest-to-goodness turning point? To really get what might be happening now, we need to quickly touch on this one key idea, the Lucian turning point. It's basically an economic theory that describes that exact moment when a huge pool of extra labor, in this case, the one Japan was using overseas, finally runs out. When that happens, there's nowhere else to go for cheap labor, and wages at home are finally forced to go up. And you know what? There are real signs Japan might be reaching this exact point. The labor shortage at home is now so intense that it's finally pushing wages higher. At the same time, big shifts in geopolitics are leading to new investment in Japan. And on top of all that, there's a fresh push for the kind of big structural reforms in tech and labor that were put off for so long. This quote from the author Shu Yamaguchi just hits the nail on the head. He says that the moment a country stops being humble and learning from the outside world, its growth stops too. For Japan, which for so long solved its problems by looking outward, the need to learn, adapt, and change is becoming impossible to ignore once again. Which leaves us with the one big question that's been hanging over this whole discussion. After 30 years, is this long economic winter finally, truly coming to an end? The pieces certainly seem to be falling into place. You've got demographic pressure, geopolitical tailwinds, and a renewed focus on policy. But turning all these opportunities into real, lasting change, that's going to require learning the tough lessons of the past 3 decades. The next chapter for Japan's economy is being written right now.